All right, hello, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel. We usually take deep dives into great theories of everything, ancient and modern, and try to probe into them to figure out how to best use them in your own life, in our own lives. Um, Today is our 534th video on the reciprocal system of theory from one Dewey Bernard Larson. And Mr. Larson lived from 1898 until 1990. He was an American engineer, born in North Dakota, did most of his work out in the Portland area. And in 1959, he proposed his two fundamental postulates about how he believed the universe operated. Larson was one of the few scientists who proposed a universe built on motion, not matter, not energy. But for Larson, the main component of the universe was motion. His first postulate states that the universe is composed entirely of one component, motion, existing in 3 dimensions, in discrete units, and with 2 reciprocal aspects, space and time. Okay, so in Larson's system, the universe is made out of motion, and motion is the relationship between space and time. All of our fundamental quantities, our scientific quantities, like matter, energy, force, pressure, and so on, are merely fractions, with space or time as the numerator and time or space as the denominator, with the caveat that space or time can come in multiple exponents. So you can have matter, for example, time to the 3rd power over space to the 3rd power. And, the most basic motion that we know of is speed. Speed is space over time. I was running at 10 miles per hour, 10 miles of space and 1 hour of time. Double the speed, I'd say I'm sprinting at 20 miles per hour, 20 miles of space and 1 hour of time. Or equivalently, you could say I was sprinting at 10 miles per half hour. You can either multiply the space or divide the time. That is a reciprocal relationship. So at least as far as speed goes, we do have a reciprocal relationship between space and time. Larson spreads that out and applies it to all of our fundamental quantities. And then he also throws in the 3-dimensionality and the discrete unit aspect. Those things I discuss in more depth in some of the other videos. If you want to look at any of my first 474 videos on this topic, you probably can get me to rehash that a little bit more. Now, Larson took his 2 fundamental postulates and then he derived a theoretical universe about how he believed the universe operated, and then compared his theoretical universe with the measured empirical universe of modern science. And in many cases, Larson was able to almost recreate scientific tables from theory, not from experiment, not from the laboratory, or the observatory, but from theory. So that leads me to believe that he was onto something. Also, the theory is very elegant, very, it's not simple, but it's way simpler than legacy science. And it just makes sense to me. And so I've been studying it for a long time. I still don't contend to understand it in its entirety. And Larson did make a few mistakes. And some of his colleagues have cleared some of those things up. But the theory has never gotten any play by mainstream anything. Very few people know about it. I think Larson actually gave a few presentations to NASA in like the 1960s, but I don't know. They either didn't take, or they didn't. They pretended not to take. One of the two. So anyway, Larson's got books on chemistry and physics and astronomy, but then he also has books on metaphysics, including sections on philosophy, religion, psychology, biology. Some of his associates have gotten into meteorology and geology, conspiracy theories. I don't mean to yawn when I say conspiracy theories. Archaeology, crypto history, ancient history. But Larson also has 2 books on economics. And we're looking at one of those books today that is called The Road to Permanent Prosperity. And we've gone through the first 6 chapters of this book. We're about to start chapter 7, which is called Wealth and Capital. Now, Larson departs from mainstream economics. He contends that they are all about what he calls sociological economics, that they are, mostly politicians and policy people pushing their policies, but that they, in order to really make economics work, it has to be scientifically fact-based. It has to actually work. He uses the example of a bridge. If you're going to build a bridge, well, you can put your aesthetic viewpoint into it, or you can say this is how I want it or where I want it. But if it doesn't comply with the laws of physics, it's going to collapse, regardless of your preferences. And so Larson is, tries to strip all of that sociological stuff away and get down to what is the basis of economics. First, he comes up with the idea of work or starve. You have to produce something or you're going to starve. And then he kind of comes up with the 2 reciprocal entities that are the foundation of economics: production and consumption. And then articulates some of his fundamental principles of economics. Goods only pay for goods. Goods and purchasing power are the 2 aspects of production and consumption. You produce goods, but they are purchasing power to the producer. They are goods to the consumer. And so right now we're about to start chapter 7 here, Wealth and Capital. It was pointed out in the earlier discussion that the actual utility of goods, forgot to mention that if you want to, we've done the whole book here on this channel, so if you want to go back about 2 or 3 weeks, you can get back to the start, chapter 1, and go from there. But you can probably follow along here, starting from chapter 7, and get something out of it either way. It was pointed out in the earlier discussion that the actual utility of goods at a specific time and place depends on the nature of the wants that can then and there be satisfied, as well as upon the inherent characteristics of the goods themselves. Food, for instance, has a high utility if it is available when and where it is needed. It does not follow, however, that an infinite amount of food at that time and place would have infinite utility. If Robinson Crusoe picks and eats a banana, the fruit contributes toward relieving his hunger, a very important want. and it also satisfies his desire for a tasty food, another want distinct from mere nutrition. A second banana is not quite the equal of the first, as the sharp edge has been taken off the hunger sensation, and the taste satisfaction probably lacks something of being the equal of that gain from the original unit. By the time he reaches the fifth or sixth banana, the ability of another one to satisfy either hunger or taste at this time has sunk to a low level, and if he keeps up the process, he soon arrives at a point where bananas have no further utility to him at the moment. This situation, we find, is not a peculiarity of bananas, but is characteristic of utilities in general. After the point of maximum utility, often the first unit, is passed, the utility of each successive additional unit becomes less and less until it finally reaches the vicinity of zero. This is called the principle of diminishing utility, and it is one manifestation of the general principle of diminishing returns, a mathematically based relation of very wide applicability. For many economic processes, the utility of the last unit of a kind, the marginal unit, has a particular significance. Of course, any one of the group could be the marginal unit. In the case of bananas, no specific one can be singled out prior to being selected for eating as having more utility than another. But this is simply because we cannot tell in advance which will be selected first. We can, however, say definitely that the first banana picked will have the maximum utility, and the last one will have the least utility. As soon as the selection is made, the utility is determined. The utility of the last, or marginal unit, is the marginal utility of the total supply of bananas. Like the supply and demand relations, the concept of diminishing returns and the marginal concept have been quite fully developed by the economists, and for present purposes, the results of their work can be accepted substantially as given in the economics textbooks. These concepts will, however, play an important part in the discussion of the nature of interest and other aspects of the cost of the services of capital later in this chapter, and they will therefore be reviewed in somewhat more detail than would ordinarily be necessary for standard textbook material. Value, like utility, is subject to the principle of diminishing returns. As the utility of successive units decreases, value likewise tends to decrease. However, the two quantities do not move in parallel courses. The actual value is generally well below the potential value because of the modifying effect of the availability of substitutes, etc. And since it is the potential value that is reduced by the diminishing utility rather than the cost of substitutes and the other determinants of actual value, the value is maintained in the face of diminishing utility until the utility reaches a low enough point to have a direct effect. But when the value starts to drop, it decreases faster than utility because total utility is limited by wants, which are practically infinite, whereas value is limited by productive capacity, ability to buy, which is decidedly finite. To illustrate how value controls productive activities, let us assume that wild pigs are plentiful on Robinson Crusoe's island, so that an average of only 4 hours per animal is required for hunting, transportation, and preparation of the meat. Let us further assume that deer are to be found less frequently and farther away, so that it requires 12 hours on the average to obtain an equivalent quantity of venison. Obviously, the bulk of the meat requirements will be met by hunting pigs, since the same values can be obtained at less cost. But as the diet of pork continues monotonously week after week, the marginal value of pork drops to some extent, whereas the desire for a change in diet causes an upward revaluation of venison. If Crusoe is living close to the limit of survival, he may still be unable to raise the valuation of venison very much, perhaps not above 6 hours, and since it is not obtainable at that cost, he will have to forego deer hunting. But if he has enough margin over the bare necessities, he may be able to place a value of 12 hours each on a limited number, say 2 or 3 animals per year, and an occasional expedition into the deer country then becomes feasible. Still more frequent hunting would not be possible under these circumstances, as venison would then cease to be a special treat, and its marginal value, now determined primarily by the cost of pork, would drop below the cost of production. As long as we are dealing with goods such as the bananas and meat of the preceding discussion, rapid deterioration prevents any appreciable amount of storage under the conditions prevailing in the Crusoe economy. There are other goods, however, which can be stored for substantial periods of time, and this feasibility of storage introduces another important factor into the economic picture. We will apply the term wealth to any accumulation of goods, and we will define the term accordingly. Wealth is an accumulation of goods. A very important point that should be emphasized here is that money is not necessarily wealth. As will be brought out in the chapter on money and credit, money was originally some kind of goods that enjoyed wide acceptance as a trading item. This kind of money is an accumulation of goods and therefore does constitute wealth, although its value as wealth is not necessarily as great as its value as money. But modern money is almost entirely a credit creation, and it has no value in itself. It is only a claim against wealth. It has value to an individual only to the extent that some other individual can be induced to accept it in exchange for goods. The existence of money or other credit instruments thus adds nothing at all to the assets of the community as a whole. This is quite obvious when we consider the question in isolation, but like so many other economic truths, it is often lost to sight in the confusion of detail that surrounds specific economic problems, and we will find in the course of our inquiry that a great deal of unsound economic thinking is founded on the fallacious belief that money and credit instruments, particularly the latter, do constitute wealth. The advantages of laying up a provision for the future in the form of a store of goods are so obvious that it does not take human intelligence to recognize them. Animals and even some plants make it a regular practice. The familiar example of the squirrel and his store of nuts is only one of many instances of this kind that can be found throughout the world of living things. Consumption of the class of goods typified by the acorns that the squirrel stores away in some hollow tree is characterized by immediate use of all the utility of the goods. When anyone eats an apple, all utility of the apple is eliminated. If we store such goods, we merely postpone the enjoyment of their utilities to some future time. No utility is derived from the goods in the interim, aside from such satisfaction as may accrue from the feeling of security against future failures of the food supply. In fact, there is usually a certain amount of cost involved in providing storage space, maintaining proper storage conditions, and guarding against loss. In order to make such storage practical, therefore, it is necessary that the present value of the utility to be derived from the use of the stored goods at some future date be sufficiently in excess of the value of the goods for immediate consumption to justify these storage costs. That was pretty rough there. Let's try that one again. In order to make such storage practical, therefore, it is necessary that the present value of the utility to be derived from the use of the stored goods at some future date be sufficiently in excess of the value of the goods for immediate consumption to justify these storage costs. There is another class of goods that are consumed gradually rather than all at once, and yield utilities to the consumers over a period of time. When a certain amount of labor is expended in building a house, consumption of the product does not take place in one act, in the manner of consumption of food. The utility, which the dwelling is capable of furnishing, is developed over the entire course of the structure. For purposes of our analysis, it is necessary to distinguish between these two classes of goods, and we will identify them by the terms transient goods and durable goods, respectively. It is convenient for many purposes to restrict the durable classification to goods that have a substantial lifetime. Many accounting procedures, for instance, allow tools to be capitalized only if they have an estimated life of more than 1 year. A similar criterion is applied to consumer goods in general by the economists, and on this basis, such products as clothing are excluded from the durable category. From our analytical standpoint, however, the crucial issue is whether the consumption of the goods takes place immediately. If not, the length of the useful period is merely a limitation on total utility and value. Time enters into the dimension of the utility of transient goods only because the life of such goods is limited. The total utility of these goods is the summation of the utilities of the individual units that can be used during the limiting period of time. Values are based on the utilities thus derived, with certain modifications due to other factors, and have no time dimension. That is, the goods have a value at a specific time and place, and the same or some different value at another time and place prior to their consumption. But they do not have a value over a period of time. An orange may be worth 10 cents at one time and place, or 20 cents at another time and place, but it has no value per unit of time. We cannot say that it is worth a certain amount per day or month. The value of durable goods, on the other hand, does have a time dimension. The immediate utility of such goods is negligible. When time approaches zero, utility also approaches zero. The utility of a hat for an infinitesimal period of time is infinitely small. But durable goods have a rate of utility. A hat has a finite utility per week or per month. The total utility of a hat is then the integral of the utility over the useful life, or we may say that it is the product of the average utility per unit of time and the length of time the hat is in service. Corresponding to the rate of utility, durable goods have a rate of value, a value per unit of time. These goods also have an immediate value, even though they have no immediate utility, as future utility is one of the elements entering into the determination of present value. In the modern economic organization, we commonly recognize both immediate value and rate of value in connection with durable goods. We can buy a house for $100,000 There's some typos here. For about $100,000 or rent for about $1,500 per month. During the month, we get essentially the same utility from the house whether we buy or rent. Indeed, we may not even know at the time whether we are buying or renting, as it is common practice to execute rental contracts with an option to purchase that calls for a portion of the rent to be applied to the purchase price. Immediate value is the present equivalent of all of the values, which are estimated to be realized over the useful life of durable goods. When the rate of value is the same for two articles, the immediate value of the one having the longer life is the greater. However, if we start with short-lived goods and examine the immediate value of goods that have the same rate of value and successively longer life periods, we find that beyond the first few increments, the immediate value increases more and more slowly and finally approaches a limit. Thus, an item with an extremely long life does not have an extremely high value. There is a limit to what an individual is willing and able to pay for it. Let us assume, by way of example, that the climate of Crusoe's island is such that he has a continuing need for a hat, and that the type of hat which he wears has a useful life of 1 month. Then, for convenience, let us establish our system of units on such a basis that the utility of a hat is 1 unit of utility per month, and the value realized from 1 month's use of the hat is 1 unit of value, so that utility and value are commensurable. Now, if an improved hat, similar in all respects, except that it has a useful life of 2 months, is produced, the rates of utility and value remain the same. But the immediate value of this new hat is 2 units, since it is the equivalent of 2 of the less durable hats. If the improvement process continues and hats with a still longer life become available, the total utility realized from a hat increases in proportion to the extension of the useful life. The immediate value, however, soon begins to lag behind the utility because of the finite limit to Crusoe's productive capacity. He is not able to devote more than a certain amount of time to the manufacture of hats, and he is not willing to spend even this much, as other wants take precedence. Hence, he might not credit a hat with a useful life of 10 months with more than perhaps 8 units of value. He might give one with a useful life of 100 months a value in the neighborhood of 50 units, and ultimately the valuation would reach a limit beyond which he would not increase it further, even if the useful life became practically infinite. The magnitude of this limiting value depends on factors such as Crusoe's productivity, the natural advantages of his environment, etc. But we know that the limit is finite, and we can deduce that it is not very high, since neither Crusoe nor anyone else in his right mind is going to set aside any very substantial portion of his income to provide himself with headgear for the far distant future. For purposes of this present illustration, we will estimate the limiting value at 200 units. Now, let us look at this same situation from a slightly different angle. The immediate value of the second hat is 2 units, and since the utility and value per month are each 1 unit, Crusoe is using up half of the total utility and realizing half of the immediate value during each of the 2 months. The consumption of the utility thus accounts for the entire realization of value, just as it does in the case of transient goods. When we come to the 10-month hat, however, we find that the 1 unit of utility chargeable to the first month represents 10% of the total utility, whereas the 1 unit of value realized in this first month is 12.5, or 1 out of 8, of the total immediate value. In this case, then, the consumption of the utility no longer accounts for all of the values realized from the use of the first hat. There is an additional increment of value over and above the value corresponding to the amount of utility consumed. As the hat life increases, this value increment approaches a fixed limit, since 1 month's consumption of utility in the use of a permanent article is 0, and all of the value realized by the use of such an article is due to the excess value factor. In the illustration given, this limiting increment is 0.5% of the immediate value. The following tabulation shows the entire situation. And he puts together a table that describes what we were just talking about. I can't even read the table, so we'll just skip over it. We thus find that the rate of value of durable economic goods includes not only the value of the utilities that will be consumed during their useful life, but also an additional amount. This increment is a direct mathematical consequence of the fact that man's productive capacity is limited, and it represents the value of the use of the unconsumed portion of the goods. In essence, the mathematical relation involved here is another manifestation of the principle of diminishing returns. Since the immediate value is always finite, that is, it is not possible to devote an infinite amount of labor to the production of any item, the extension of useful life results in continuing decreasing increments of value until a point is reached at which the value increment due to consumption of the utility is 0. The rate of value under this limiting condition is the value of services of wealth, a quantity that can most conveniently be expressed as a percentage of the immediate value. In the example cited, it is 1/2 of 1% per month, or 6% per year. Okay, we're going to stop off there and finish this chapter tomorrow, or hopefully finish this chapter tomorrow. Please tune in then. Thanks for tuning in today, and have